this lecture, what I wanted to basically discuss with you is what is a clinical audit and how it differs from other types of studies, especially like research studies, and what is the uniqueness of clinical audits and how we basically conduct a clinical audit. That is it's a very basic idea. Of course, Pratibha and others probably may be planning to have more detailed lectures in the due course with regard to specific topics. But here, what I'm trying to do is to provide an overall idea. So now, as I said, first to understand what is research and clinical audit is very important. We practice Western medicine. It's based on Western scientific philosophy. That is, whatever the things that we practice are based on the knowledge generated by previous generations of human beings, right? Throughout the evolutionary history. That's what we do. So basically, the foundation for this Western science is the scientific method. So basically, we observe things and then we ask questions why certain things happen, and then we go to the literature and read about whether previous generations and other people, other human beings, what they have observed on this topic, right? That is the literature search, basically. And then we try to see whether our initial question could be answered from what the previous human beings have discovered, right? If that can be answered, that's fine. We have an answer. But if we cannot answer, or if we cannot explain our observation or our question based on what other people have investigated, then we have to have a learned guess. That is, we hypothesize things. This may be the reason for our observation. So then, well, we do experiments to test whether our hypothesis is correct or wrong, right? And then we collect data, we analyze data, and then based on that, we come into conclusions, we interpret the data and come into conclusions, right? And then we share it with other human beings, right? That is what we do through journal articles, through conference proceedings, in conference abstracts. That's what we do. We share our new knowledge with the fellow human beings. And then the very beautiful aspect of this is that when we share our findings, we are very transparent. We are showing our methodology and say that this is the method that we followed and this is the result that we got. So basically, we allow the other human beings to interpret what we have done and how we came to conclusions, right? That's what we basically do in our research conferences. And when you present an abstract, that's exactly what you are doing. And that's what exactly the judging panel would see, whether you are transparent in your process. And then based on that, you develop new interventions, right? Or you might find new questions that you have never thought of before while doing the research. And then to answer them, you do research again. Now, this is a cycle, continuous cycle where humankind generates knowledge. Now, this is scientific method, right? Now, following the scientific method, we do various kinds of clinical studies. Now, from the very basic things, like, if you categorize all the research or articles, publications published in the scientific, journals and so on, they can be categorized according to the strength of the evidence, how strong the evidence is. The bottom ones are basically like editorials, personal opinions, expert opinions, and case reports and so on. Those are basically highly biased, our own observations. But when, gradually, there's a hierarchy of quality of evidence. Like, you do experimental studies, and then you do case series, and then you have cross-sectional studies. Sometimes you have case control studies, and then sometimes you have randomized control trials and so on, right? So those are basically primary research in order to generate evidence. Primary research in order to generate evidence. But nowadays, if you look at studies, even randomized control trials, which are the highest of primary research. Now, even if you take one topic, there may be hundreds of different randomized control trials available done in different parts of the world, including different types of populations and subjects and so on. So then how can you come into a conclusion which practice is the best, right? So then that is where the secondary research comes, where people critically evaluate the randomized control trials, right? Or other studies and see which studies carry more bias and how we can actually pool the data together and then finally give an answer to the original question, right? So it's basically kind of summarizing and critically evaluating other scientific studies to give a final conclusion, right? So now we start audits from there. So basically, now after summarizing all this scientific evidence based on original research, people develop guidelines for various management practices, clinical practices. So the guidelines are based on highest quality evidence in most of the time. But if they're in absence of highest quality evidence, we can't wait for generations until people do research. So in such instances, experts gather and they come into consensus and develop guidelines. So basically in the audits, what we do is now people have done research, develop guidelines, but then these guidelines has to be practiced in our settings. Now the role of audits is to check whether what is practiced in your setting is actually in conformity with the set guidelines, right? Whether what is practiced in the real time, in under the practical situations in your units, whether they follow the evidence-based guidelines. Basically, in essence, that's what is meant by audits, right? So basically, and then so basically in the research, you generate new knowledge which can be generalizable to the whole population. You take a sample, look at, and then you tell stories that can be generalized to the population, right? But in audits, you are not supposed to develop any new knowledge. What is done there is you compare what you've done here in your setting to the set of standards that are already developed by others. It's just a matching of set standards with what you do, right? And not only that, after matching, what you do is basically, if you find out that what you practice does not match with the set standards expected to be done in your setting, then you have to understand why this happens and whether what sort of actions you can take in order to improve the adherence to the set standards, right? So after one audit cycle, you will find out what is lacking in your system and you come up with proposals to improve it. And then do another round of audit to say, for example, educating your staff, right? Or taking some actions with regard to, not only educating, but implement a certain process to, increase the adherence to a certain guideline. And then do the audit process again and to see now whether the adherence is more compared to the previous cycle. So likewise, so this is a continuous system improvement process. That is what is understood by audit. But there are certain other similar kind of things like service evaluation studies. So those are basically very similar to audits, but audits always compare the current practice with the standard. But service evaluations are basically designed to describe what you are doing at the moment without comparing to a standard. That's what is meant by service evaluation. But here our focus is on audit. So I will try to compare research and service evaluations with the audit. For example, knowledge-wise research generate new knowledge, but audits and service evaluations, they basically, they checks whether the existing pre-developed knowledge, evidence-based knowledge is used for practice, right? So philosophy, research basically hypothesis-driven. These are not like that, comparing the practice to a standard. And interventions in research, sometimes you do interventions, new interventions, and test the effectiveness of new interventions. But in audits, there's nothing like that. No new interventions. You always, check current practice against a standard. And statistical thinking, usually now in research, because you take most of the time you take a sample, because you can't study a population, and then you study the sample and then try to forecast something towards the population. Therefore, the sampling and also statistical thinking part should be solid or sound, because otherwise you can't come into valid conclusions. But in audits, it's not always like that. Of course, there are situations where you need to have statistical thinking in audits, but it's not an absolute necessity, right? It depends on the circumstance. And the generalizability research, it's always focused on generalizing it to others, right? To other settings. But audits, basically, it's about your setting. It may not be able to generalize into other places, right? And then utility, especially research, develop guidelines, but audits and other studies, basically they checks, you follow guidelines, right? And the other important thing is ethics. So research, now the whole principle of ethics is, especially human ethics, is that doesn't matter whether it's research or whatever, any other studies, if it involves humans, in principle, you need to have ethics. But for research, it's always ethics is required. But for audits and service improvements, you do not need ethics approval because it's a system improvement process. However, if you are going to publish your audit in a journal, definitely you need ethics, right? So at the very beginning, you need to understand whether you need what you are going to do with the audit. If you are to publish it in a journal, definitely ethics is required, right? And not only that, for example, in your audit process, I will explain that later. If you collect personal sensitive data and then you handle that, definitely ethics involvement is there. So your audit review committee might ask you to get ethics approval because this has something to do with ethics, right? Okay, so that is the difference. Now I'll quickly take a couple of examples. Now this is a I hope you can read. So now see just a hypothetical situation where there's a disease called disease C, and you have two antibiotics, both A and B can be used. But now the guidelines say that the first line of drug is antibiotic A, right? But then, however, drug B also being used by physicians based on their experience, right? So this is a common scenario, not only antibiotics. We see this all the time, right? So our personal experience, according to our personal experience, we practice certain things. So in this scenario, if you are going to do a research may be about, now our way of thinking is to generate new knowledge. So basically now as a researcher, what I would think is, now there's this disease and there are two treatments. So what about comparing the two treatments when it comes to the effectiveness of the treatment, right? So that is research. That is research. However, in audits, what you need to do is basically, the question is whether your unit adheres to the national guidelines on treating the disease C with antibiotics, right? If not, so that means if the guidelines say the first line is drug A, now you need to check in your setting actually how common this practice is, whether all patients receive the drug A as the first line, or some of the patients receiving drug B, what is the percentage of that, and what are the reasons for that, right? So that is the audit. Now you can understand, once you publish an audit, I mean, it's of local relevance. Internationally, nobody would care, because this is what is audit. This is what audit means actually, right? So the whole idea, what you can do with this data is to improve your setting, not to, improve other settings. That's of course there can be secondary basically secondary sort of usefulness when it comes to other settings. But this is the idea, right? So basically, the same problems, research and audits look at in different ways. So another one. So for example, say now pre-medication for antivenom reactions, right? The SLMA guidelines say adrenaline subcut 0.25 ml should be given 1 into 1001, right? Before antivenom. But commonly, there are other drugs also being practiced. For example, in addition to that, some people give antihistamines like clofentramine and so on, and then hydrocortisone, and then, but the guidelines clearly say not to give that, right? And also, you observe some patients, instead of having adrenaline 0.25, receiving 0.5 as well, right? So if you are looking at research question would be effectiveness of subcut adrenaline 0.25 ml versus 0.5 ml with regard to preventing acute adverse reactions, right? That is the normal thinking on research sense. But audit-wise, it's about truly whether your unit adheres to SLMA guidelines for antivenom pre-medication, right? And if not, why? And how can we improve the adherence to the SLMA guidelines when it comes to antivenom pre-medication, right? And service improvement, as I said, we are not comparing with the standard, so that it's about like what is the current pre-medication practice of antivenom in my pre-medication practice of antivenom in my unit, and how effective it is, something like that, right? So those are the scenarios. Now I think you understand clearly what is an audit and what is not an audit. So now the NICE, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, basically they define a clinical audit as a quality improvement process that seeks to improve patient care and outcomes, right? How we systematically review the care or that what we provide at the moment against an explicit set of criteria. And the idea is to implement a change, right? So I'm emphasizing this because it's not about just conducting an audit and then just, finding out something, or we are not adhering to this practice and stopping there. You can't do that. Basically, it's just about halfway of your audit process. Definitely, it should involve, right, identification of problems and your plan of intervention and how do we basically improve this. And then you need to have a way of suggesting the improvements and then implementing the improvements and re-auditing to see whether that your interventions of improving the system has worked or not, right? If it is not worked, then again, you have to discuss why this happened. How can we re-improve this? And this cycle can go on like that, right? So therefore, this is not like us doing a small research, publishing or submitting an abstract to a conference and present and I'm done. It's not like that, right? So therefore you have to have a clear understanding of what you need if you really want to do an audit. Is this what I really want to do, right? That's why I actually take a bit of time to emphasize this, right? So, and then we can actually look at structures, or that means a framework of things. And also we look at certain processes, ordering an investigation and delivering the investigation report. Those are processes. And also outcomes, whether the patient is better now, or how does it count when it comes to the outcome of the patient, right? So things like that. And then also the changes that you suggest in your process can be just targeted at individuals, maybe an individual or a group of people in your team, or the entire team, or service as a whole, right? So therefore, the audit cycle actually begins with identifying the problem or the issue. You need to identify, if you are to do an audit in your setting, you need to identify your audit question, right? After identifying the audit question, then you have to identify what are the standards that I'm going to check against or compare with my, whatever the practice or the thing that we are going to test. And then collecting data, and then you have to compare the performance of your setting with the standards, and then implement the change, and then re-audit. So this is called audit cycle, which actually includes, I have oversimplified it, but there are various other steps, like, for example, agreeing for standards and things like that. I will now, rather than just going through all this, I would like to organize this as a series of questions. Now in Sri Lanka, actually, now different other health systems, they have well organized systems of facilitating clinical audits. For example, NHS has their own way of, for a very long time, facilitating audits. So in our setting, I think that still these things are being developed. So basically, we don't have set national guidelines or standards for exactly what to do if a medical officer needs to do an audit, or your unit needs to do audit. But in developed countries, like in other settings, like in UK, basically they have nationally recognized priority areas for audit. So if you are going to do an audit, basically when you try to get the approval in the institutional, through the institutional, audit committees, they basically check whether you are actually dealing with the nationally recognized important area of doing, audits. And then basically, based on that, they facilitate how to do all this. But here, we don't have any of these things yet developed. But I think this is one site that you might visit when it comes to some of the information is actually available. That is Directorate of Healthcare Quality and Safety. I'm to take you the website. Yeah, so they have resources, various ones. Some may be relevant, some may not be relevant to you all. Just if you have time, go through. They basically have various initiatives on improving the knowledge on how to conduct audits and all that. They have some resources and certain formats for specifically developed for system improvement. You can go through and have a look at your leisure. So I'll start with a few questions, right? So I think research as well as audits or any other thing, first we have to be honest why we are doing this, right? Sometimes if we are not very clear why we are doing this, then there's a problem. So why should you do audits? Basically now it's not something that you on your own do. It's about mostly audits are teamwork, right? So anyway, either you or your team, why should you do? What is the benefit? What is the benefit to the system? What is the benefit for you and your teammates personally? Have a clear thought about it, right? Without knowing that, or without being clear about that, it's useless to do or start any research or any audits, right? Be clear why we are doing this. Secondly, is my audit question important, right? Now, important in the sense, is it important to the system. Sometimes some of the audit questions that may arise are very time bound. That means maybe for a certain time period, this may be valid, but quickly the importance may disappear. That's, for example, like in COVID situation and all that, you understand certain things. Sometimes, of course, certain things may be important for long term, but sometimes the situation changes so that the importance may not be that, that it may not last long. So think about that, right? Whether the audit question is important. And then the next important thing is standards. Now, the most important part of audit is finding out standards. Usually, now, most of the time, if the guidelines are available nationally or internationally, they become the standards, right? But if there may be situations where no guidelines for what you are doing. So in such cases, you can develop your own standards, right? So basically, the principle is that standards are based on best available, highest quality evidence. So we assume that the guidelines are based on highest quality evidence. But in case of the absence of highest quality evidence, your team, your audit team can actually go through the evidence and come into a consensus. These are the standards that we are going to set according to, or as long as you can justify, that's fine. Especially, it's very important. Sometimes there may be standards that are developed in other settings, but no local standards or the local guidelines are developed. Now, if you are to implement fully or a guideline that is developed in another setting, and then try to take it here and compare your practice with that, that may be completely a failure, right? So that is where you need to have your team and discuss among yourself how we can basically adapt this standard to our situation. Now, especially in Sri Lanka, most of the colleges actually, they have developed national guidelines. They have involved in developing national guidelines, which is the way to go. Basically, they not only look at the international guidelines, basically they look at what is the practical situation in the country, and they have developed guidelines accordingly. So national guidelines are basically very good sources because they are, you don't need to do you don't need to reinvent the wheel. Basically, it's there. You can clearly use those guidelines. But in what I mean is that in absence of such guidelines, then sometimes you have to go through through the primary data and secondary data and see what evidence is there and how we can make the standards, right? So basically, standards should be specific. They should be measurable, right? And agreed between your stakeholders in the group members, and should be relevant to what you are checking for, and theoretically sound. That means evidence, right? Against whether it's evidence. So the next thing is who's going to be involved, right? Now, it's not now, as I said before, this is a quality improvement process. So if you involve as many people as possible, right, who are relevant to this, whatever you are going to do, say if it is something regarding to ordering, pathological reports or something like that, then it's not all about the person who orders or person who gives you the feedback. It's about the entire community that is involved in the entire process, right? Involving everyone is very important, because otherwise, if you are not involving important people for this process and you are only doing it from your unit, from your side, nobody will be interested in implementing it, because when it comes to implementation, everyone needs to agree with you, right? So that is why, especially administrators sometimes, right? You can't leave administrators. And then nurses and other healthcare professionals as well, not only just different units of clinical care, but other professionals also might be important and should be involved in proper audit processes. Sometimes you might need to involve patients as well as stakeholders in these committees, right? So it's not only about, as a doctor, how I think that the system should be, and then, doing a research like that. It's not like that. This is completely a different thing. And also think about the time frame, right? Sometimes like you can't do audits taking years and years, right? You should be able to think about a realistic time frame for your data collection, and then finishing the first audit cycle, implementing the changes, and then moving into the second audit cycle, right? And then what kind of data and sources? For example, say sometimes audits can be prospective. That is, you gradually collect data prospectively from here onwards in the future. Or else, sometimes you can go back to the patient records like BHTs and get the information like in a retrospective manner. But then you have to be very realistic. Sometimes when it comes to the recording, BHTs may not be the very good sources. Sometimes people may not be recording things properly, right? So then in such cases, you may have to do prospectively. So it all depends on what you are looking at, whether the source of data is actually valid for your research question, right? And then there are certain other ways that we can think of making our results or the audit findings meaningful. For example, sampling. Now, sometimes, say you are looking at a process like, say, surgical waiting time in the theater, right? Now, if you think of minimizing the say, I don't know whether there are guidelines as such, but surgical people might know. But certain countries, there are guidelines for example, this maximum waiting time in the theater would be, say, we hypothesize that 2 hours, right? Or maybe 1 hour or whatever, right? And then if you are going to do an audit, and then if you are including emergency cases and pediatric cases and other old stuff that, that might influence your result, that's not going to happen. So sometimes in initial planning of the audit, you might have to think which patient groups I'm looking at, which patient groups to be excluded, which cases to be excluded, like that, right? Previous. And also say in the same thing, how do you exactly look at the patient records and verify that these times are accurate and exactly followed? Things like that. Those are things, practical problems that you need to think of before starting audits, right? And then there should be a way of comparing the results with the standards. For example, percentage of patients, so the cases where the set standards were met, and percentage of cases where set standards were not met. And then, so that is just about comparing the percentages. But then sometimes it might be a scale, right? Where you just say that, how many patients, now you provide a scale before, and saying that according to the scale, say from very bad to say full adherence. You set a scale and see that how many patients actually fall into the, say, fully compliant group, whereas partially compliant group, things like that. So you have to initially think of how do you compare these, or make these comparisons with the standards. And also administrative and ethical approval. Now, in Sri Lanka, I think for audits, there's no centralized audit approval system, and it's not actually necessary as well. But in institutional level, definitely if you are to conduct an audit, you should get the permission from the director. But ideal situation is having audit committees, so that which includes the director as well, so that they go through your audit proposals and then approve it, or recommend certain changes, and then monitor your audit process, right? So in Anuradhapura, we have established an audit committee. So that, but I think Pratibha may be aware. I don't know how many hospitals at the moment have their own audit committees. I think very few probably having their own audit committees, right? So, but here we have a audit committee. So to assist, it's not only about approving the audit or not, and also it has another function that is assisting your audit or maybe making certain suggestions to improve the audit proposals, right? And then ethics approval, as I said, whether this is an audit that requires ethics approval, whether you are, how do you handle certain things? For example, if you are taking the personal information from the PhDs and then putting in your own database, right? Now that is a problem with regard to the patient confidentiality and all that, right? Sometimes the audit committee might ask you to get the ethics permission, right? And then if you are to publish this in a journal, definitely you need to get ethics approval as well, right? And then, especially patient surveys. If you are doing patient surveys, directly data collecting from patients, that means you are not looking at the not only looking at the patient records, but you are basically interviewing patients. So that is definitely something that requires ethics because it's participation of human subjects, right? And then audit forms, especially sometimes when you develop various data collection forms for your audit process, sometimes there may be situations where the audit committee feels like there should be an ethics approval for this sort of information collection, right? So like that. And then the next big issue is what is the forum for presenting audit findings and taking action. Now, so once you do the audit and say you come up with findings that, are very important findings that needs a change in your system. So then who's going to look at the findings and are people happy following your suggested improvements? So there should be a forum. Right now, we are also having this discussion. Basically, audit review committee is one forum where you present it to the audit review committee, but there are other forums like ideally there should be a forum, right, in a hospital to present these things and then come up with suggestions, right? But here at the moment we are also in a discussion to how to implement this, forum for audit presentations, right? And then taking actions once we decide on various, once we decide on various actions, how do we implement and whether people all agree to do these things. So there should be, the idea of this forum is that, right, all the stakeholders coming together and agree to implement and then start or move into the next phase of the audit cycle, right? And then finally, whether I'm going to publish this, right? That is the other important thing we have to think about it. Now, what we thought was when, like especially at least in Anuradhapura, if there are audits being completed, we were having this initial discussion in the journal also, because this is of local relevance. You can't publish most of these studies in other or international journals or any other journals. But in Anuradhapura, we were thinking of facilitating an audit section to the journal so that facilitating audits to be published. Those audits done in Anuradhapura and North Central Province, the relevance to North Central Province, we can facilitate that in the journal to publish audits, right? So that we can assist in the future. We haven't got any yet, but we are ready to open the journal for publishing our audits. So what you do, as the first step is, after thinking all these things, is to develop an audit proposal, because that proposal is required for you to submit your audit proposal to the or the application to the audit review committee, right? So basically, it's like any other research proposal, but especially this part, the methodology part should include, right, the plan for comparison of data and also plan of providing feedback. How do you, what is your action plan in implementing if there are changes, and real auditing process and all that, right? So especially in the initial part of the proposal, clear justification of standards is important, because as I said, if there are no guidelines available, then there should be a way of how you express that, how you come into a conclusion, consensus when it comes to setting the standards, right? So finally, there's this good resource, that is Healthcare Quality Improvement Partnership. They have criteria and indicators of best practice in clinical audits. In Sri Lanka, we don't have best practices, but these are like UK developed ones. They are not basically just, you know, they are not fully compatible with what we can do, but you can get a guide for that. Yeah, so this is the one. So basically, this basically explains what sort of angles that they look at in their setting, in looking at this proposal as or what they recommend as best practices in their setting. So you can have an understanding in our setting how we can basically adjust these things. So finally, my take-home message is, now this clinical audit process, you can easily learn these things. There are many resources available in the YouTube and other websites that I have shown you as well. There are material that can be, you know, that you can study. But the idea is that in our setting, there's no full facilitated framework for conducting audits. It's about that's what the ACS is trying to do here, trying to clear our path and provide a mechanism. But that's what we try to do here, right? So there are no explicit national guidelines for you to follow. This is how to do all these things. But of course, there can be a guidance that we can provide, right? Through the audit review committee, I think we would be able to provide some guidance. When you provide, when you submit your applications, we might be able to provide some guidance, or even beforehand, if you need any assistance, I think through the ACS would be more than happy to assist such, you know, proposals to, you know, to flourish actually, your initial proposals to be developed and then submitted to the level of approval. So that's the whole idea. If you have any questions, you may ask. I'm open to discuss.
Sir, there's a question on Zoom. Do we need ethics input to be considered if we do collect patient data for database, for generating the database, but when we publish the report, no names are mentioned, only the statistics?
No, you need ethics. That is the problem. Basically, you collect data from the patients. Even if you anonymize it, still you are using the patient data. So if you are publishing, definitely you need ethics. That is the requirement. There are several such similar instances that we came across in our journal as well. There was a couple of publications, good quality publications actually submitted. They initially conducted this as system improvement. However, they carried de-identified patient data, but those data were collected from the patients without patients knowing that our data are collected for this purpose. You understand the basis. So if the patients were given their permission prior to the publication, that we provide this data for publication as well, that's fine. But if the patients are providing data for your usual clinical management and patients are not aware that their data are being used for a publication, then there's a problem. So in such cases, you must need ethics approval. Of course, what you can do is, if you think that we are only taking this for system improvement, there's a way of doing it. You basically write to the ethics committee and ask, this is my situation. Can you exempt ethics approval for this study? And then the ethics committee will say that, okay, we actually studied your problem and you don't need ethics. That letter is enough for a journal. If the journal, what journal editors would look at is whether you have ethics exemption, right? If the ethics are exempted, no problem.
And also the same participant is asking which officer is responsible for ethics in a hospital.
Now, ethics is, now the thing is this one, I think the question whether a study adheres to the ethical principles, right, of research, the primary responsibility is the researcher. So if the researcher has taken ethics approval, the ethics committee provides the ethics approval, and ethics committee has the right to check whether you adhere to the agreed ethical principles, as well as whether you are meeting with the conditions. If you are not meeting with, say, the certain statements that the ethics committee has made, or certain, whether there are certain limitations of your ethics approval given by the ethics committee. Ethics committee is the responsible body that actually oversee that, and whether to revoke your ethics approval or to warn you or to stop the study. All these authorities with the ethics committee. However, within a hospital, conducting any study with or without ethics, the hospital director must give the permission. Without without hospital director's permission, you can't do a research study even with ethics approval, because ethics approval is something different. It's towards protecting the participants, right? When it comes to ethical aspects, but the patients belong to patients are government. They came to the hospital for seeking treatment, so it's under the care of the hospital director. So you have to have that approval as well. So if the director is concerned that this study making a trouble in the system, he can actually himself can complain to the ethics committee and revoke the ethics. That's what, or he himself can stop the study saying that I'm not going to give that approval. So the whole idea of having this audit committee is that assisting the director, that with multiple people involved in and giving different opinions and taking a collective decision on this process rather than putting it to a single person, right? That is the whole idea of this process. Right. Okay, so then with the absence of any other questions, I will wind up the session. Thank you so much.